Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement here with Circle founder Robert Perry, and this is part 2 in our 2-part series with Foundation for Inner Peace President Tam Morgan. We didn't expect this to be a 2-parter, but we were having so much fun last time that we decided to keep the party going. In our last episode, we talked about the spiritual gifts that presented themselves in Tam's childhood, experiences of precognition and extrasensory perception, and her friend, and how this was actually an inspiration for Tam's mother, Judy Skutch-Whitson, to become more involved in psychic phenomena. Judy, of course, went on to become one of the original publishers of A Course in Miracles and a close friend of its scribes, Helen Schucman and Bill Thetford. Our last discussion was a bit of a looking back, and so today we thought we'd pick up where we left off, but also look ahead to where Tam hopes to see the foundation go and any hopes that she may have for the course itself. And we're also, of course, happy to share the same for us here at the Circle. So welcome, Tam. It's so nice to have you back.
Thank you. I was horrified when I heard what we talked about last time.
Really? Oh, it was such a great discussion.
All kinds of exploding light bulbs.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I had to change rooms because the lights exploded in the other room.
Yeah. And the fact that you confirmed the truth of that story, that was great. So how much contact did you have with Bill, and what are your main memories of him, especially him as a course student and, how he changed in his later years?
I enjoyed Bill immediately because he wasn't in my face. Not that Helen or Ken were either, but just his style was to be more quiet and then say things under his breath, like little puns, and that I found very funny. And I usually hear what's said under the breath. And he was more like, in certain ways, like my stepfather, Bob Skutch. He was more quiet, but as you got to know him, a lot more came out. So I had a kind of cuddly relationship with him. I'd sit next to him, we'd hold hands. I would listen to the conversations going around, but I wasn't all that interested. Certainly as the teenager, I liked being seated next to him at the table for dinner, because he was funny. He was really very funny. And that's what attracted me to him. I saw the dynamics in the room that were very clear over and over again of the kind of divisions between Helen and Ken and my mother and Bill. And, my mother was a safety zone for Bill, same as vice versa, because Helen could be attacking with a single quick word or sentence, like jab, jab. And they kind of needed each other to completely join in purpose of loving Helen when she was that way. And Ken, as I said, was just so completely devotional. There wasn't any need for protection or anything. Plus, Helen rarely said anything that was unkind to Ken. So it was a part of that dynamic that I felt for Bill in the dynamics of the situation. And I felt that there was some, I don't know, the word is coming, like usury of Ken sometimes against Bill. And Bill would take a deep breath, and I was an empath, so I would go to where the empathy needed. Not that Bill needed that from me, but we did make light of things. So as a course student, as Bill as a course student, I can only do this from hindsight, not from what I was conscious of then, to say that what I saw in Bill was he closeted a lot of things. We know he closeted, being gay. We know he was in the CIA. He was someone who could keep emotions and secrets in, and he closeted his feelings a lot. They were repressed, but I could see them more clearly as the type of child that I was. And I can tell you that the more I not only knew him as I became a young adult, But the more I saw him as he got older, I saw him be freer and more comfortable. And just that would relate now to saying that his coursework was working for him. And it wasn't just that Helen had passed and he was in California and he was free of that very intense dynamic, but that he really was practicing the course. And he was becoming more and more comfortable being associated with the course, even in public, meaning private groups. It wasn't, all of the covers that he had. When I first met him, a lot of those covers had been removed. And he was pleased with it. And that's why I was laughing, in hearing the Bill Thetford version when that wasn't the version he used. He was very committed to the blue book that he was using. And he was, I just saw him getting more and more and more free. And the story that my mother told about his last moments were really him dancing around the living room, circling and saying, I'm free. And she said, free of what? And he said, I've forgiven everyone. I'm free. And he did his little Bill dance. And he was very funny. And he just got lighter and lighter and lighter. And he was always extremely kind to me. I would say many of our conversations, if not most, were more him as, an uncle asking me what was going on in my life rather than me being old enough to say, hey, what's going on in your life? So I didn't have a lot of those questions. I did meet some of his partners in life and knew them, some better than others. And
did he ever have a serious partner, Tam, that you know of?
Oh, yeah, he did. And
long-term serious partner. We never hear about that side of his life.
I did an interview with Jules. Yes, he had Jules, and he certainly lived with Pat Hopkins. And he had partners. He was just very quiet about it all. And he was really, really, able to, he was an expert at maintaining certain different personas, different places.
When you were talking about him getting lighter and lighter as he got deeper and deeper into his course practice and more willing to be associated with it, the thought that was coming to my mind was exactly as you shared. On the day that he passed, he was dancing around Judy's house. I guess they were preparing for a 4th of July party, and he was saying this was his Independence Day. And then sure enough, it was really his Independence Day because he died of a heart attack that day. And Judy was evidently the last to see him alive. Did she share with you anything from that day beyond what we know?
Yeah, it's funny, talk about like guilt provoking. I was doing errands for my mother for the party, and I came over and she said, stop in and say hi to Bill. And I was like, I'll see him later. And she said, just come in and say hi. And I was just like, Mom, I'm doing all these things for you. I'll see him later. And I didn't, so there was always that, I could have just gone and given him a hug, but I knew he didn't care. And I certainly, didn't dwell deep on it, but it was always a little thing in the back of my mind. But the kind of funny thing, and this is so Bill and me with puns, because I really share a love of puns. This wasn't an actual pun. It was a joke. That little feeling I started to feel of guilt because I said I'd see him later and didn't. It ended up that during his memorial service, everyone was gathering in Tiburon for it. And my mom asked me to be with him as he got pushed into the crematorium, actually into the fire, because she wanted to make sure it was him. And I had to make sure he had his shoes. Like I got his shoes. And I was like, oh my God, I am seeing you later. I was kind of the last person who saw him.
Wow.
what I expected, but it made me laugh, and it kind of alleviated the guilt of not giving him a hug goodbye that I wouldn't have even known was a hug goodbye.
You talked in the last episode about being able to hear your mother. Do you have any experiences of hearing Bill from the other side?
No, I will tell you a very funny experience I had. I mean, I feel Bill. He's, this room that I'm in is my own foundation office that kind of made itself during a move when a lot of things from my mother's came to my house, an abundance of things. So I was telling the movers, okay, put this in that room, this in this room. And it was overwhelming because my father had passed too, and I had a lot of his estate stuff coming into my house and sorting who they go to and what happens with the stuff of my mother's. And I had COVID. And so I was really sick, like literally at the last day of that move. I didn't know it, but I had COVID. I was very sick. I had fever, and I'm walking through my hallway, and there are all these pictures that my mother had on her wall that were on the floor, leaning against the wall. And I'm thinking, where is the office going to be now? My mother's home is not there anymore. And that's where, her office was. And then I had this feeling like I was in a mausoleum, because all these pictures of all my dead relatives were in this hallway that I was walking through. And then I turned and went into this spare room that I had. And I was kind of shocked and a little delirium of fever because everything was set up. It was so strange. In the bookcase, I said, oh, put the books in there. And there are all the translations of the course. And this portrait of my mother that I had leaning against the couch was there. And then pictures of Helen and Bill and my mother and Ken and Bob Skutch and Whit, my stepfather, were all placed by the movers in certain places. And the typewriter that Bill typed the course on under plexiglass is like in the room. And I sat down on the couch I'm sitting on now, which happened to be a couch where my mother and Whit, her last husband who did all the translations, we would squish on this little couch together when any of us had a problem or some exciting news. And we'd all squish together, hold hands, and either deal with the conflict or, share the news. And so the couch was suddenly in this room too. And I just looked around and went, oh my God. Here's the office and the picture of Bill in this room. And it was I just kept hearing, we're here, we're here, we're here. And it was so condensed that I was very surprised. But that is to say that I feel Bill. Every time I come in this room that was made for this, at least for now, I'm hoping, as we talked about, Emily, of having an archival showplace or museum for the typewriter, for other things. But when I step in this room, they're all here and I feel very connected to them. And I feel like it's an easy place for me to meditate. It's an easy place for me to ask for guidance. And it's like a condensed energy. So the other silly story I have, believe it or not, is that the short version of this is that someone sent me to a medium, and my mother, well, I can't make it short. Sorry, it's me. When my great grandmother passed, right before she passed, my mother had a kind of afterlife psychic experiment that she was doing with someone called Ian Stevenson to
oh my gosh,
pick a word.
Yeah.
And it was to set a lock. Do you want to say what your oh my gosh is?
Oh, well, Ian Stevenson, hugely significant figure in the study of children's past life memories.
Ah, yes.
Seminal figure.
So for my mother was just getting into all her research, parasensory investigation, and she had my great grandmother set a lock that was a word. So that after she was gone, my mother could find that word and see if she had connected with my great grandmother. And so she went off to different mediums in England, and they gave her all sorts of messages. And my mother felt like she got the word. And of course, this is one of those you never know, but that my great grandmother had arthritis and she was in her 90s when she went, and she couldn't quite set the lock right. So she thinks she got the word minus one letter, that my great grandmother didn't set it properly, but unknown. In any case, so she went off to mediums and got all these messages and blah, 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 that were very meaningful to her. And then before my grandmother died, she said to my mother and me, when I'm gone, go see this one woman. And she gave us a name, and we said, why? Who is that? She said, oh, I heard of her on Phil Donahue. She's supposed to be good. So we did. We made an appointment several months after, give my grandmother time to transition or whatever. And we had a really very funny, profound reading from this person. So before my mother passed, I said, tell me, what do you want me to do? Like, do you want me to go somewhere? And she said, I'll let you know after I'm gone. I'll pick someone after I'm gone. And so I said, okay, that's funny. Fine. And what happened, I forgot all about it. And someone came to me and said, I had an amazing conversation with your mother the other day, and someone very, very close to my mother. And I was like, okay, good. Everyone's telling me that they have dreams of her and blah, blah, blah. I hadn't heard from her, yet in that way, like that specifically. And they said that, you have to go see her. So it's like, I forgot all about it. And this person was in England, which my mother she was a snob about, mediums. They should really come from England. They have a great long history of mediums in England. So it's like, okay. Anyway, it was one of the more extraordinary readings that I have ever had. And I have even been hired to assess psychics who do readings for other people to say, what do you think of them? Because I've grown up so much with this. And, one of the things that I could do was read a psychic. Where were they coming from? Were they coming from their heart? Were they coming from their mind? Were they, all of that. So people have asked me to assess for them. And it's been a very funny little side thing that I have done for people in my life. Anyway, this was an extraordinary reading. And it was very much about, a lot of it was about the work that I'm doing. And in it, Helen showed up, and, my mother showed up, and all of these people were gotten by name. Now, maybe she could have gone online and seen things, but there were some things that no one online knew, and names that no one, they weren't online. You couldn't research it. So I was definitely interested in what she was saying. But it's all like dinner theater to me, at the same time, it's just a fun play. But one of the things that brings me back to this is that there was something throughout it. She says, well, there's someone in the background, very quiet. And, and she says, do you know a William? And it's like, I know so many Williams and Bills. My stepfather was, we called him Whit, but he was William, like so many that we would call anyone named Bill or William, like a different name, so that we could know and distinguish them. Anyway, it just went on, and she got so many people right, and so many feelings, emotions correct, that at the end, so I said, I know a lot, I wasn't giving her much in this. And then she said, and I'm thinking, if that is Bill in the background, because she was talking about Helen and my mother, I said, if that's Bill, he would give me some pun. So, no. So I wasn't giving anything, even though a quiet man in the background. Anyway, throughout the reading, she kept seeing like a column, or like a pillar. Do you know of a pillar anywhere? And I was going, no, I don't. I can't think of something that would strike for me. The end of the reading, she says to me, do you have any questions? I say, absolutely not. You brought so much. I mean, talk about dead on, literally, figuratively. You were great. I said, except for one thing. What is this with the column, the pillar? And she said, well, it doesn't mean anything to you. I said, no. And she said, well, it meant something to me, but I didn't want to impose my life on this reading. And I said, well, why don't you tell me what it meant to you? And she goes on about how when she was a young girl, she would go to this camp with her parents, like just for a weekend. And every year they go to this camp. And I said, oh, was there a pillar there? She said, no. But on the way to the camp, there was a town that they would stop in and they'd have lunch. And there was a pillar there that marked the town. And they went, oh, that's interesting. And she said, she starts talking quickly about this town. And she said it was called Thetford. And I just started laughing. I was like, Bill Thetford, got it. Pillar, the call, that's one in the corner. And so that's how I felt I heard from Bill in that kind of weird way. And when things happen, when I'm thinking of him and something funny and quirky like that happens, that's how I feel I hear from Bill. And it's a long story for that, but it's the only answer I really have for it.
Okay, so the website says that you were tasked by Louis, Helen's husband, to interview 30 of her closest friends and associates, and that a book will be coming out of those. I believe so. Okay. Yeah. And I feel like I've been hearing about this book for 20 some years. And like, what's going on? Tell us about it. So
after Absence from Felicity, I was close to Louis, who Helen called Jonathan because she didn't like the name Louis. And I would meet with Louis every whenever I would come back, or when I was living in New York, we would meet and go to lunch and talk. And he was upset after reading Absence from Felicity. That's not the Helen I know. I don't know that person. She'd never had those conversations with me. Granted, she never talked about the course for all those years with him either. But he said, no, I need you to go out. And I was with my mother at that point. And I need you, Tam, to go out and to interview everyone who knew Helen, who's still alive, so that you get to see who she is, as a person as well, from this book that's out there. And he used to call Course in Miracles the book. And but so he was really riled about Absence from Felicity's view of Helen. And and so I was always doing these like side special projects and stuff. And so I said, okay, I'll be glad to go do that. But as my mother was so perfect, she said that, if you're doing that, I also want you to interview, people who knew Bill the same. So I said, as an aside, Tam, your mother said to me something like what Louis said. She said, that's Ken's picture of Helen. That was not my experience of her. Right. No, that's true. That's true. People had different experiences of different people. I mean, when you think of Helen editing the time when she edited with Ken, I'm sure it was a very different Helen than anyone else. Helen's relationship with Ken was different from her with anyone else that I saw. I mean, they had a unique relationship. And I would not say that his perception was wrong. I'd say that was the Helen who was with Ken. And there weren't lies made up. They had a very unique, separate relationship where she could be comfortable with what came through her. Or even with Bill, she wasn't comfortable. But with Ken, she was in a different way. At least that's what I saw. Yeah. But in any case, Louis, who hadn't even been told about the course for all those years, was like, wait a second, what about my Helen? It felt like that. What about my Helen, the person who I knew? That's not being represented out there. So it wasn't so much that he wanted me to write a book about the other Helen. He just wanted validation, that his Helen was not only this other being that was represented in absence.
So what have you learned from your research so far that?
So what happened in doing these interviews? I have a very bad memory in certain ways, and I did it, and I showed up, and I gathered all these interviews, and they were really fun, and I really enjoyed them. And some people said, I don't want this out till after I'm dead, or you can't this is off the record, or whatever were some of them. But they really were rich and interesting to me. And I compiled them all, and we had them, transcribed. And then my mother had them edited, because we were going to make a book out of them. And when I read the editing, even though the editor was fantastic and did just what my mother and he planned, I refused to let it be published because it was so whitewashed. It was like all the color came out, because it was of that time of what did it mean to preserve someone's integrity and privacy. And there was things in there that were not ready to come out at that time in my mother's world. And I think that link between more almost the Facebook generation versus the private, look a certain way, be a certain way, even though I was way older than the Facebook generation. I just felt one of the more interesting things about Helen and Bill was their human flaws. And it came out in these interviews. There were some very personal things, and they were, to me, funny as hell. But they were still preserved, and my mother did not feel comfortable with them being.
So how long ago was that?
I don't remember. I'm horrible with years, but I was certainly in, my 20s and latest 30s. Every so often an interview would come, someone would come to town and I would interview them. So I haven't honestly myself looked back on them. I have them all. And what's happened because of the digital age and all of this, instead of publishing them as a book, I think I might want to produce them as the audio versions, themselves, so that they're not edited. So, and I want to see, I really, truly keep saying, yes, I'm going to do this. And I've been so busy that it requires more than 2 minutes to do it. I really have to.
Is there anything from the interviews that you feel should be out, that should be known about Helen, that you wish was known about her outside of what we know from Absence from Felicity?
Oh, yeah. I think there's plenty of rich stories told by their best friends. Helen and Louie's best friends were Sonia and Dave, who were Bill's first cousin and his wife. And they were a riot, and they spent a lot of time with them. And so there's some really funny stories that definitely I personally, these are in my property. I own them, not the foundation. Even though I did do them through foundation time and work, they still were considered my properties, which is why I got to say, no, you cannot send out this whitewashed version of them. So yes, and I do think that they will be just more interesting and fun. And it's as I say, it's like the side notes. Do you read Helen's side notes? Not her notes of transcription, but all of the little side questions. It's as interesting as that. It's as interesting as something you would read in People magazine. Is that a value or not? I don't know that it's a value to the course itself, but is it of interest to people so that they can relate? Wow, you don't have to be a saint to have this material come through or to practice this material. That's where I think its value is. And
how fascinating.
Yeah, I will be. It's not off the charts amazing. It's amusing. It's interesting. It's different perspectives of people, where you see a Rashomon of that's what makes the whole person, the different perspective. So it will come out. I just have to have the time to get to it.
You were in such a unique position to observe so much. By unique position, I mean, as a teenager, I'm sure you were very aware of the dynamics, as you've been saying, but also not really required to kind of be in the mix. So you could be more of a fly watching what's going on. And you do have some incredible and really interesting observations about the relationship dynamics. And I'm somebody who's very interested in dynamics. And so I'm just curious as to, you mentioned that there was Judy and Bill and Helen and Ken, and there was a bit of a divide, Bill leaning on Judy for safety from Helen, and Helen relying on Ken because he was so devotional. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, do you think that Helen relied on Ken for the kind of devotion that she really wanted from Bill?
Oh, completely. It was almost like her showing up. This is how I wanted you to be to me. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, and I watched, especially as I got older, the dynamics of, saying to my mother, to Judy, take care of your little brother, about Ken. They were siblings, and they, even in inherent sibling rivalry stuff came up, and also teaming about the mother. I saw my mother and Ken talking about Helen, and okay, how do we appease her? How do we take care of her? How do we so there were so many different dynamics that were very familial in that group. And very incestuous, obviously, but not really, just in feelings. So
we always wondered if the advice, take care of your little brother Kenny, when it was given to Judy, caused her to step back from her teaching role, because she could have really been out there as a public presence and a teacher, but she didn't teach until after Ken was gone.
She wasn't, I don't think she saw herself. Tam's going to say she didn't see herself as a teacher. I know Tam's going to say that. But I think you're talking about a public speaking role, right?
Yeah, a public representative of the course. Judy stepped back from that until Ken passed, and then she got more front facing. And I'm just wondering if feeling protective of Ken as the forward facing representative of the course was part of that dynamic. Like if Judy actually felt like that was taking care of little brother Kenny by letting him be the public face of the course.
It's whatever we say, it probably has nothing to do with the actual real truth, which we know is love. But from a perspective point of view, yes and no. From one perspective, yes, she was told to take care of her little brother, and Ken became the teacher. And my mother did not see herself as the teacher. My mother's role was already, before Ken was the actual, Ken was teaching as my mother was traveling. But remember, my mother traveled in 1 year over 200,000 miles talking about the course. She didn't teach the course. Her whole job was literally, as I see it, planting the seeds of awe and inspiration. Although the course doesn't like to use the word awe, but the actual flame. My mother was a networker extraordinaire, and she could bring people in and make them enthusiastic about a grain of sand. And say, oh, isn't this the most incredible grain of sand in the world? And then everyone, there's a talk about, I think it was Stan Groff, who was in Israel, and he was just starting, I guess, in his career, and he needed some people to come to this talk, and not anyone was showing up or signing up. And if I get the story right, he called my mother. He told me the story. He called my mother and said, do you know anyone in Israel? And then like 100 people showed up at his talk. My mother was extraordinary that way. And I think that Spirit used her for seeding for publishing and seeding. She didn't see herself as the role of the teacher. She didn't want to be a teacher. She felt that she was always self-effacing about her own intellectual prowess. She was really quite a brilliant woman and had a thirst for knowledge, but she never thought of herself that way. She never thought that she was the smart one. And she thought my brother was brilliant, or, her ex-husband, who was my biological father, an incredible, smart man who worked his way into his intelligence. But my mother had an innate intelligence that she herself did not respect or value. And maybe as she got older, and when she was 89 and broke her ankle, and she woke up and she said to me, I didn't wake up. She was up all night. She said, I've just decided I want to master something before I go. And I think I told you this. I said, what, Mom? Like, you're 89. What are you mastering? And she said, quantum physics. Because it brings together the consciousness research I was doing. Finally, the language is able to express that through science. And she just got every book that she could hear online. And she had a friend come almost every Sunday to talk to her about quantum physics. So she had this brilliant mind, but that's not what she saw herself as. So the roles got very defined. We talked about familial. I mean, in families, we each take on a different role. And then we see our sibling as having, I see my brother as being the brains and I'm the emotional intelligence. So that role got defined early on. So it wasn't that my mother felt, oh, I would have been the teacher otherwise, if not for Ken. I think she felt very clear, Ken is the academic. Ken, in this way, Ken has studied with, my mother would laugh when people would say something about that they'd studied with Ken and Ken felt blah, blah, blah. And if my mother disagreed, she'd laugh and went, we both studied with Helen. we were both Helen's students. So there were things in her disagreement of perspective with Ken, and there weren't a lot, but there certainly were some things. My mother didn't really get her own voice. And when I say her own voice, she was fabulous at sponsoring other people, if sponsor's the right word. Like, I was the little child psychic. My mother was such an intuitive, I cannot tell you, but she put me in the front row center, and not her. And that was one of my pet peeves with her. It's like, why aren't you doing this? Oh, no, I'm not intuitive at all, which was crazy. She was the most incredible receiver I have ever met. I mean, she could feel that something was going on, if you were thinking. She was amazing, but she didn't take accountability for that. So as she got older and as she hit her 80s, she found more comfort in her own voice. Part of it was losing the lawsuit, where she felt like she was this good girl and she did everything good, and then bam, it all came in her face and she had this heart attack, and she had a spiritual dark night of the soul. Like, okay, who am I here? And she started to gain her own voice and comfort in it gradually, really gradually, as she got older more and more, and link that with the digital age. There wasn't media for her to go on years before to say, I want to do a podcast, I want to do a webinar, this is fun. And that happened as Ken was passing. So it was like a weird baton, but it wasn't, oh, now that Ken's gone, I can say what I want to say about the course. There were so many pieces that came together to make what happened happen. And it was almost like they all left so that it was my mother's turn, because she was the only one left there. Bob Skutch wasn't of that ilk. And
that's how it felt, at least to me, was that Judy really found her voice, public voice, after Ken had passed, and close to her own passing. You just saw her a lot. And we have a funny story from Bob Rosenthal. He said that Judy came in and to his office and said, I think we need to start a podcast. And he was like, well, I don't want to be involved in that, but go ahead. And sure enough, she did. And she started this podcast that continues to this day. And I admire her spunk.
Webinar too. was the one who said, we need to do webinars. And then she started to say when she was doing the podcast, aren't people realizing that people are listening to podcasts more than webinars? Why aren't we focusing? She was extraordinary. She was extraordinary.
Yeah.
So as I say, everything in retrospect fits together, but it wasn't as conscious of, I would have taught if Ken didn't. I don't think it was that at all.
Okay.
And
do you have anything?
Go ahead.
That said, because Ken was the teacher and became the teacher, she did indeed back off in certain ways around the teaching. She wasn't as out there about what was her voice in it. That's why I kept saying yes and no and, they're both true.
She was so active for years there, and she was really out there, and then she kind of vanished. And in my mind, it wasn't like, why weren't you the teacher? It's like, why didn't you keep doing that? And I asked her that once, and the answer she gave was, well, I don't want to do that. But I wondered if there was more to it.
The more that was to it was, and I can say, being the age that I am and of knowing my mother so well and where we're similar, she felt she did her job. She traveled so much, and she ended up being in a relationship where the relationship started to take precedence. The love that she was learning and doing, and as she got older, I'm calling it energy math. That's what I'm calling it now in my life. Like, how much energy do I have at this point where traveling was so easy at a different point, and now it's a little bit harder? How much do I have, and what do I want to do, and what do I want my life to be like in the day? How much energy do I have? And her energy for traveling, it dissipated tremendously. The only energy she wanted to travel with was to see her grandson back east and to maybe go to Hawaii with Whit. And she was looking for more peace. And I will say that the lawsuit and all of everyone's different opinions and attacks on her and what she did and what she didn't do, it took a lot out of her. It really did. It was like, I don't feel like being in community in the same way. I want to do my job, to publish this course, to do what I agreed and contracted with Helen. And that's what I want to do. And let Ken be the teacher. Yay, thank God I don't have to be, that's not my role. And I want to focus on hospitality for publishers who are coming in, people who are interested in meeting me, and my family. As she got older, that became more and more and more present in doing that with the digital arena. She could find that she could be public in a much easier way where she didn't have to travel. So that's why she stepped in. It was like, oh, I don't have to move. And she stopped wanting to do webinars because she felt she had to look a certain way. So she had to go to the hairdresser, and she had to get dressed in a way that presented her in a certain way, so that then she loved podcasts, because she could actually, if she needed to, stay in bed, and do it, which she didn't, but she didn't have to get dressed. And towards the very end of her life, as things got let go, and she got as more free in the Bill sense, she'd show up in a webinar with, a scarf and a robe on, and she wouldn't do all that was so necessary, but she liked them much less. She felt she had to prepare too much for webinars versus the podcast. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I don't feel like I have to prepare for the webinar, but podcasts are just so easy. The ones where we're not visual. So it really was that she didn't, if anything, I would say the lawsuit did make her go, it's too much bother, community. I'm not here to heal that. I'm here to keep publishing this course in this version, that's my job. And so, and her relationship with Whit, which was so extraordinary, deepening every year. And he oversaw 27 translations. There was a lot of work to be done there. And so they stayed home and they did their work, and people came to visit them. And I'm sure that Whit would have been doing webinars and podcasts with her had the timing evolved to as it is now, as easy it is now.
What I wanted to ask and what we've wanted to ask is just what is your picture, your vision for the foundation's future to the extent that you have one? And what's your sense of how you'd like to see the course evolve in the world?
Okay. So I am completely with the program of the course, which has been since the beginning of on a need to know basis. It's not for me to see a future of the foundation. It's truly to see what's in present world, what needs to be done. And I can tell you that in my mind, what I see and what I like to see is what's going on now. There's more open to community. I feel community is important, especially in the digital age right now, where we can connect this way. That's not been the focus of the foundation before. So there's an outreach. Whether that changes, I can't tell you because I only know what's now. I also hope that in the foundation, there's not one face anymore. It's not just me doing these things, that we have a beautiful, beautiful, like staff who I want to be empowered each as we're all leaders. There's not one that's doing this. We ask everything together. It's not one person heading this like it was my mother and my two stepfathers, running this. It's not like that anymore. It's a team effort. And so that's my vision, is something different instead of one person out there. So I really want to empower that within the organization. And as far as it going forward, I am 100% committed to continuing to, making our version of this material available for as many people who gravitate towards it as possible. And I will say, that's included in saying, read other versions and see which one, feels right for you. But our version, which I feel like it works. It works. Forgiveness, healing, love, it works. And I want to make that available, which is the mission of the foundation, is to publish and to basically distribute and discuss. And so we're still sticking to that mission and mandate. And how it evolves, I don't have a clue, because I'm not supposed to know the future. And for someone who is an intuitive child and precognitive about all sorts of things, it's fun to be surprised and have a wall about the future and just keep doing my job in the present of, am I feeling love now? What is this for? What is this for? Constantly asking. And
yeah. Well, along that line, Tam, our board at the Circle a couple of years ago did a full-scale strategic planning process. We brought in a third party to lead us through it. And one of the questions, it was a guided process. So we would all break, seek our guidance, come back, and then talk about what happened. And then we would develop some focus areas from there. But one of the questions where we broke apart, asked for individual guidance, and then came together to discuss it was, where should the organization go over the next few years? And what was so interesting is that we think guidance is more legitimate when more than one person gets it.
Yeah.
The only piece of guidance when we came together through this whole process where everybody got the same thing was in that question of, where should we be in the next few years? And everybody got, it's not for you to know. And so we felt like that was legitimate. We did as much as we could to keep our focus areas, and then we work within those focus areas, but they're more short term than we had originally thought they would be. We felt like that was real guidance, that we shouldn't know where the whole thing is going in the future. We just figured Jesus has that covered. So it's interesting that we have that in common.
Yeah, well, in the special notes, as I was told it, but now I go back to the special notes and messages, from when this group, the core group, would ask Helen to ask the voice, they were told very clearly, you are not to have a 5-year plan. You will know what you need to know when you know it. And as it was told to me over and over again, it's that this course will be in so many forms, it will be unrecognizable. Now, I have not seen that in these special messages. When I go
I
back
have not either, because Judy said that a lot.
All the time. And there's
all the time. Yeah.
There are things that happen. And even Judy was laughing herself when she would go back and go, where was that? Because I heard it. Things get interpreted, and that was certainly her interpretation, and so it was Bill's too. And because I remember the talk about it, but it wasn't specifically said that way in any case. But I have to say, so far it's not untrue.
Yeah, well, it's just so interesting that we both got the same kind of guidance. And I will say, on your mission of publish, distribute, and discuss, it's been so wonderful to see the foundation pick up on the discussion piece of it. The podcast, I think that you're doing excellent work in that podcast, and these webinars that the foundation is hosting, you're talking about really important topics. And so I just want to use this as an opportunity to say how much I've enjoyed those and to keep going with them. And I know that we also, in terms of the distribution angle of your mission, have you and others at the foundation to thank for your searchable online course, which we even use here. We have our own, but we use yours as well. And that's just really, really wonderful search functionality and availability for the course in the world. So thanks for your part in that too.
Absolutely. And thanks for your part. Really, I think we're each doing what we are hearing to do. And I'm just glad to get to enjoy talking with both of you.
Yeah.
So before we close, Robert,
I've got one more question.
Okay.
I got one more question. I'm sorry. And that is, I think there's a both and here. Okay. This is my honest opinion that you can say, I don't have a 5-year plan. I'm following guidance in the moment, and guidance can often give you general directions to go in. General directions are different than do this exact project right now. I think there's room for follow guidance right now, and guidance gives you general directions. So I'm interested, just to probe a little bit more. Have you obviously get a lot of guidance and all kinds of crazy stuff happens to you. Have you either personally or like through that reading you mentioned from the British medium, have you had little glimpses of general directions to go in or glimpses of future things to shoot for? Just thought I'd ask.
Good question.
It's a good question. Yeah, they're much more personal than business oriented. I mean, I feel very much in service to the course, really deeply, profoundly. But I think for me, I do feel like my glimpse is for the latter part of my life. I don't know what that means in the timing, just to have fun. I've done a lot of service in my life, and to really, as I say, let an empowered team move the foundation forward at a later date when it's ready and when it's fully developed. So that's my own personal glimpse and goal, rather than the word from above or within saying, set it up this way. It's just starting to happen, and I'm pleased with that. I'm pleased with seeing other people coming in who are younger, and our organization is filled with a bunch of old people, elderly, like 64 and up. Although we have people of other ages, I would like to see it be more youthful in coming into future generations. But that's not a message from above. It's just, my own feeling that we need.
That's our feeling here too. We'd like to see an audience that's more diverse in age, and also just more diverse in general. So the final question I have for you before we close is, what is the word that was in that locket? I've been wondering.
The lock.
Oh, the lock. So
The
it was
lock,
a
yeah. What was the
Well,
word?
it-
I've been
We'll never really know because it didn't unlock it. But my mother was absolutely convinced that the word was walker, because my great grandmother was an incredibly independent woman, had to start using a walker. And she had a lot of resistance to it, and there were jokes about it. And the word came through several different mediums when she was overseas. And so my mother really felt it was that word, but it didn't open the lock. And my mother was absolutely convinced in her own being that my great grandmother got one of the letters wrong. So I haven't spoken to you.
well,
I
Tam,
don't know how you found it.
thank you so much for talking with us, for being so generous with your time. We have truly appreciated this. I feel like we could have a part 3 if we wanted to, but we'll
I
leave
think
you
we have
alone.
a part 10 if we wanted to.
But just with our sincere gratitude, thank you truly
Yeah.
for these discussions. They've been very meaningful to both Robert and I know I
Yeah.
speak for him when I say that.
No, I'm really glad. Well, thank you both. And it can be continued whenever we feel like. So
All right.
off camera, whatever.